Hello, thank you all for staying to the last session and not going down the pub. I promise that we're going to make it worth your while. We've got a great panel here and we're going to talk about the interplay between social mobility and educational inequality. I'm sure you're all aware of the data on this and the research that kids from poorer households are less likely to go to a school rated outstanding by Ofsted, more likely to earn less when they start a job, more likely to drop out of college, and even less likely to get and apply for an apprenticeship. So on our panel today, I'm very delighted to welcome Ambrily Phillips, who's the Executive Head Teacher of the Wellington College Academy Trust. So, shout out there for Ambrily. Since moving to the UK from Trinidad and Tobago, she's worked in the education sector and in September became the Executive Head at the Wellington College Academy Trust. Her goal is to work in developing countries to improve education for the most disadvantaged, including the poor and girls. Next, I've got Debbie Mansell, an I Will ambassador. She's really keen to make positive change. During her Duke of Edinburgh's Awards, she helped run a club for 18 to 12-year-olds in her village. She helps with Venture Summer Camp and is now volunteering as a trainee leader for the Brownies in her university town. Sir John Holman, Emeritus Professor of Chemistry at the University of York, has a whole string of jobs, it seems. He's an advisor on education at the Wellcome Trust and the Gatsby Foundation, founding director of the National Science Learning Centre, chair of the Teacher Development Trust, and president of the Royal Society of Chemistry. Ed Vainker is head... Oh, sorry. At the end, I missed out Lucy, but I'll come back to her, is principal and co-founder of the Reach Academy in Feltham, which was judged outstanding in 2014. He's currently a member of the National Forum of Head Teachers and spent 3 years on the staff at Teach for All. Lucy Crahan is 2009 Teach First Ambassador and author of Cleverlands, The Secrets Behind the Success of the World's Education Superpowers. And it's a fabulous book. I really recommend that. It's just full of nuggets that you might find helpful. She taught science and psychology before completing a master's at Cambridge and has spent a year advising foreign governments on education reform at the Education Development Trust. We're going to start off by I'm going to invite each of the panelists to just say a few words about the interplay between social mobility and educational inequality. It's not a uniquely British phenomenon. It's very persistent in other countries, particularly the United States, where, like in the UK, we're seeing a widening of the gap. The income and wealth gap, but there are very particular British aspects to it, as I'm sure you're all aware. I'm going to start off with Ambrily, if you could just give us your opening thoughts.
Hi. Short of doing extensive research, I guess, into sort of universal issues surrounding mobility or educational inequality, rather, we know there's a particular issue in sub-Saharan Africa and in West and South Asia, particularly affecting girls. However, I do think that social mobility is not unique to the UK, but I think it's definitely an issue that we must address urgently. I believe there are 3 reasons as well why social mobility is a recurring issue in the UK and has not been solved. One being the government's failure to actually invest in higher education, particularly universities. 2, children who come from less advantaged backgrounds are literacy poor. We know that children from middle-class backgrounds actually have heard 23 million more words than those from a less, more privileged background, rather, before they get to school age. And 3, I think it goes without saying that our education system is severely underfunded and actually crippling at the moment. And unless we actually invest in teacher programs, teacher training, and also middle leadership development, I think that social mobility will continue to be a chronic problem. I do think we can solve it. I'm not going to go into the detail. Hopefully I'll have a chance in a second. But I do want to look at the differences in Trinidad and Tobago, which is where I come from, where I think we are actually achieving social mobility because of what the government has done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Debbie.
Yeah, so I picked up on the Social Mobility Commission's research in 2006, and it was saying again how the problem's getting worse, especially for young people. This is a problem that is actually getting worse in the UK right now, not better. And I did a dissertation on rural poverty in the UK and young people. Same sources from the 1800s to now were saying the same things, and I think it's time that we don't just talk about it, that we actually act on it, because there's enough people that want to, but I think it's definitely through events like this, we just remember we've actually got to act on it, because there are young people that are still being affected by this.
Thank you. Sir John.
So why does a professor of chemistry and the president of the Royal Society of Chemistry come to the Teach First conference to talk about social mobility? Well, the first reason is I love Teach First. I love what it does, and I love the energy that it brings into our schools, and you can feel the energy in this room. The second reason is that I've been a teacher of science the whole of my career in schools and universities, and I realise that science is a great key to social mobility. Science qualifications open the door to many wonderful jobs. The third reason is that I've been a head teacher. Earlier in my career, I was a head teacher, and I reckon I was head of a pretty good school, and I reckon we gave a lot of opportunities to young people. But I knew that not all of our young people, even though they had the same opportunities in the school, had the same opportunities that when they left. And the national data makes this very clear. People who graduate from universities with the same qualifications, have got the same abilities, don't have the same chances when it comes to getting jobs and getting into real social mobility. And that's because of things that happen outside of the school. So I'm very interested in this question, and I hope to talk more about it later.
Thank you. Lucy.
Hello, everybody. So, perhaps in an attempt to be controversial at this late stage of the day, I'm going to say that I think part of the problem in England particularly is we focus too much on social mobility rather than focusing on educational equity. So my perspective, obviously, is for an international one, having spent time in some of the world's top-performing education systems. And I went to 6 different places, all that do very well in these international tests. And 5 out of the 6 of them, they're not selecting children into different schools or into different classes until age 15 or 16. Instead, the focus is all about how do we get all children up to a high enough level that they can then choose at age 15 or 16 what of several equally valuable career options they want to pursue, rather than this idea of, well, let's rescue the poor deserving children and send them to Oxbridge. There's a very different shift of focus. And because there's this focus on actually everyone's going to get up to a particular level, the whole of those systems are focused on that being the goal, and then arranging the entire system, aligning the entire system so that that is a possibility rather than just an aspiration or a hope that we might have.
Thank you, Lucy. And thank you for introducing the S word, selection, but from a slightly unusual perspective. Ed.
I knew if I took the headset and got to look like Taylor Swift, someone would steal my thunder over to the right. So I was going to say something very similar, and I think the problem is that children doing their GCSEs, the bar that the system and schools aspire to get to is not the right bar for young people. And the problem is that schools are successful and are appreciated and are respected at 16, but also at 11 and at 6, when they're putting pupils on a path to what is fundamentally a mediocre outcome. A C at GCSE does not allow you to access a rigorous academic post-16 option, and the whole system needs to be pushed up. And I think with that greater educational equity, we would see social mobility much quicker. So I'd agree with you.
Now, are there people on the floor who want to participate? Or if not, I'm going to open up, just continue questioning. But I would like to know if anyone does want to question. I can't really see you, but I'll try I'll try my hardest. But please just wave if you do want to say something and participate, because this is your event. And while you're thinking about that, I'm just going to ask each one of the panelists to give us an example of learning from across the world or their own experience that they have come across that has made a difference. Practical examples.
I think we must be really, really careful to not begrudge the system that actually put most of us in this room. As I said, I grew up in Trinidad. I came to the UK 14 years ago. I spent 22 years in Trinidad. My dad was a bus driver. My mom was a secretary. Neither finished school, neither went to university, and I'm sure that's the case for a lot of people here. University for me was a real option, and it was an option that I knew would set me free, essentially. And I know it's not the only option, but we know it is a real option to break the poverty cycle that a lot of people experience. In my country in 2004, funny enough, the year after I finished, the government did something really radical. Trinidad is actually the third wealthiest country in the Americas after Canada and America for GDP, PPP per capita. We are blessed to be located in a place where there's lots of natural oil and gas. However, what the government did was they used that money to invest in what they knew made a difference, which was education. So from 2004, every single person in Trinidad, young and old, could access an undergraduate degree for free. And if they wanted to do a postgraduate degree, it was 50% funded. My mother, at the age of 57, took advantage of that and actually went back to university because her two daughters did, and she thought actually she wanted to role model that to my nieces and nephews as well. But what happened was the participation rate, at that point increased from 7% to 65% in just over a decade. It made education accessible. And in this country, when you come from a poor background and you're told you have to pay £9,000 a year and you're going to leave with an average of £50,000 of debt, you're going to look at other options that's not going to set you free. You're going to think to yourself, maybe I shouldn't go there, it's only for the wealthy. And in this country, we've put a limit on young people's aspiration by asking them to pay for university. I left university. Thank you. I left university and my debt was minute, and actually it started with my mum investing in £100, which my father thought was too much money actually, for me to go to university. If I was born in the UK as a black Caribbean girl, I would not be standing on this stage today. We have to do better in this country.
I'm going to go to Lucy next.
So I'm going to pick a fairly concrete example because there's a lot of system-level structural things, but something that is perhaps most obvious in terms of way that some of these countries are supporting their young people to access a variety of careers is through student counsellors. So in both Finland and Canada, there are counsellors employed in schools. And when I say counsellors, I don't mean counsellors as we often understand it, which is more about therapy, which is important as well. But these are people whose job it is to talk one-on-one with students, check how their learning is going, and ask them about their plans for the future. And okay, if you want to do that, have you thought about what subjects you're going to need? How are you going to access that, that kind of thing? And in Finland, it's actually one step further. So every school will have at least one careers advisor or student counsellor, and they have lessons. So in year 7, year 8, and year 9, they will have weekly lessons on careers. In year 7, it's more around learning to learn, but year 8 and year 9, these are all the different wonderful things that you could do. Let's have a think about what you want to do and what avenues you need to take in order to get there. So something really practical, because I do think here, sometimes the children don't know what they need, and so they make the wrong choices at GCSE or they make the wrong choices at A-level because no one's really told them. They haven't gone out to find that information themselves, and then they're not actually able to access what they were hoping to do.
Okay, well, I'm going to pass this to John, but before I do that, Debbie, I'm giving you warning. I'd like you to think about since you're the closest to being in school than anyone else here on this panel, if you can remember a real aha moment at school that made a difference to you and your ambitions. But in the meantime, I know Sir John has got thoughts on career advice.
Yeah, because Lucy's touched on something really important here, and this is career guidance. And if you think back to your own career guidance in school, university, between us, we could show that this is really quite patchy in this country. I did a study for the Gatsby Foundation a couple of years ago. We went to 6 countries to see, 6 countries that really do it well, to see how they do career guidance. And it's quite clear that there isn't one single magic bullet. It isn't just the counsellors. They do a great job. It's doing, we decided that there were 8 things. In fact, we created 8 benchmarks. It's doing those 8 things consistently and well. And amongst those is the very important step of giving young people experiences of the workplace. And this is so important for people who come from backgrounds that don't necessarily have the rich experience of what high-skilled work is, what graduate employment is like. They need, more than anyone else, the opportunities to see the workplace, to have encounters with employers, to have in-depth work experiences. And one of the many ways that the system is not fair is that it doesn't give young people from deprived backgrounds the same opportunities to experience the workplace, to get internships, to have work experience. They don't get the same opportunities, and that is the only thing that will make it fair for when they move on to employment eventually.
Thank you. Well, Ed, maybe you can speak to that. What do you do to try and make sure that kids from less well-connected families can get work placements?
Well, we make sure they get really good grades by doing mixed ability teaching and being really rigorous in how we approach our exams. I think I'd just like to say a word about something that I took from overseas, because in 2010, I was living in Washington, D.C., and I was introduced by a fellow ambassador to Rebecca Kramer, and we decided together that we were going to open a school, and what really inspired us was the charter school movement in the States, and we had a shared experience in visiting schools like KIPP and Uncommon. And I think what's really exciting today is that if we were doing that today, we wouldn't actually need to go across to the States to see those schools. We would be inspired by King Solomon Academy and by what Max Heimendorf has done there. We could be inspired by the transformation that Chris Fairbairn is having in a school, Totteridge in North London. I know there's someone that I'm working with, Emmanuel Akpang, who's setting up a residential children's centre, children's home, and he is working with someone from Jamie's Farm and with Jamie and the team to take their learning. So I think we're at a real tipping point where, as a community, a lot of the solutions to the problems that we have are within the community, and when we work together and learn from each other, that can have a huge impact.
So that's about involving the community. Okay, here. Debbie, what about your experience?
Yeah, I'd say for me, the best things that helped push me were family. Like, my granddad couldn't really read or write, and my nan, and they always put a very high value on education. And I think we always can take it for granted in this country compared to other countries how good our education system is. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good, and it's free. And I think sometimes for too long we've took that for granted. And I think the other thing for me was, at school, I wasn't always encouraged. I was deterred from going to sixth form. I was told I won't get like my maths GCSE. But I think for me, it was having a few good teachers that did help and push me. And I think you can't underestimate how much like a kind word, when you've heard all these things, you can't do it, is. So I think it's really having that relationship with your children. But also I think doing stuff outside, like volunteering with brownies, and now I'm a guide, run my own brownie pack, gave me the confidence to maybe want to pursue higher education, because the idea of moving away and going into something completely new that I didn't feel I was actually able to do, I couldn't have done without that wider experience as well.
Yeah, I certainly know that my kids went to high school in the US, and they weren't allowed to graduate unless they'd done 200 or so hours of voluntary work. You can't get your graduation certificate unless you do that.
I'd like to pick Debbie up on a point. I'm not even sure I agree, anymore, and this is very controversial, that we are offering a good education in the UK. Last year, only about 53% of the whole population actually left with a good grade or good set of grades in English and maths. So my question is always, what happens to the other 50%? We know for a fact that actually children from less advantaged backgrounds tend to be more likely to go to inadequate schools and schools that require improvement. In other words, our poor children are subject to the worst teaching in this country. And this debate is about social mobility. The fact that we know there's still an 18% gap between young people who are able, studying A-levels, going to university, if they come from a free school meals background, and those who don't. And when we look at the statistics for the best universities in this country, the gap is 42%. That's stark, considering, that we are trying to foster an education system that's equal for all. We still have a lot of work to do, because what the statistics do tell us is that there's only an 8% gap in terms of free school meals and non-free school meals children when they come out of university and accessing jobs. So the gap gets smaller when our young people from the most deprived backgrounds actually access the highest level of education. We have to invest in our higher education systems. We have to invest in literacy, because our young people at an early age cannot access the curriculum if they cannot read, and we have to do more in early years and foundation stage to improve literacy levels of our most deprived young people, and we have to invest in teachers. We need teachers in front of young people. We need good teachers, and we need as many teach-first teachers in front of young people who believe that they can do the best, and I think that's how we will achieve social mobility in this country.
I can see that Ed wants to say, but I just want to, is there anyone that wants to ask a question? You don't have to. It's not a test. No, okay, I'm just going to go to Ed then.
I wouldn't invest in higher education, and I don't think that the reason that more young people from a range of communities don't go to university is the cost. I don't think that's the evidence. I think the investment needs to happen in 0 to 5. I think that those of you in the room who teach reception and nursery, massive shout out to you. You're all fantastic. And I think you will know that that achievement gap at the age of 2 and the age of 3 is absolutely massive. And there is evidence-based work that can be done from the moment mothers find out that they're pregnant that can put those children onto a path of choice and opportunity. And when you close the achievement gap at 2 and at 3, you see a massive impact down the line. And so I think that's where the limited resource that we have, the limited investment that we have, should be spent, and I'd love to see more of our best teachers taking the huge challenge of going to teach in the early years foundation.
But Ed, what are they aspiring to if they're not going to invest in higher education? What are they actually working towards? And I think that's something that we we're looking at it from a universal point of view. And I'm saying in my country, where they did invest in higher education, more people went to university. Trinidad, their working population, there's nobody in the working class category because the government invested in higher education. The wealth of the country is built in our education system. And it's not just about degrees and jobs, it's also about investing in human potential and giving all humans the ability to access education at every single level. Yes, close the gap at the bottom, but also give us something to work towards. Because I knew I could go to university for a small amount of money, I aspired to go there, and nothing was going to stop me but me. And that's the hope children from Free School Meals background with our aid as teachers must push to get them there. I think there's too little funding in higher education, and therefore young people are put off by it and not aspiring to be there. Their lives are not changed as a result.
I guess as someone who educates... It's great, and I think it's fantastic, and I think your story is inspiring, but I guess as someone who educates children, 780 children in Feltham on £5,000 a day, I'm kind of puzzled what the universities spend their money on, and I'm not necessarily sure we should give them a lot more money.
Okay. I do the same job.
Yeah. I think I've recently been in a lot of schools because I'm doing my PGCE, and I think there is a gap at the bottom. Like, I've gone into outstanding schools in better communities, and their kids in the same year, I was in year 2, and a school I've been in recently that is just out of special measures are still not even achieving their reception targets in their year 2. So you have to work so far behind, you cannot even meet the national curriculum for year 2 because they're so far behind. So I think there is definitely a need for some work in early years, because I think as well with the barriers to higher education, it is the cost, it is a deterrent, but I think it's also about, when I did my research with people in rural areas, young people, they just didn't feel they even had the ability or were allowed to dream. You'd ask them, what do you really want to do? And they just didn't feel like, what's the point, because we're never going to be able to do it anyway. So I think there's also like that poverty and aspiration as well.
I think there is, but just to back up what Ed said, I know there's a lot of research that shows the returns on investing in early years, but you have to follow through. You can't just like stop when they're 3. Sir John.
I agree that early years are so important. They're the formative years, and everything else is built on that foundation. But I just wanted to do a slightly different point, which is about our incentive system. Because any system functions in response to the incentives that act on it. And in this country, particularly in England, we have a very powerful accountability system that acts on schools, on primary schools and on secondary schools, and actually on universities as well, a different type of system. In schools, I'm talking about Ofsted, and I'm talking about performance tables. Those incentives cause the institutions to act to optimize their own performance. So the primary school is incentivized to act to develop its performance and do as well as it can against its performance measures. The same with the secondary school, the same with the university or the further education college. And I think, and by the way, looking around the world and having visited a lot of other countries, I am pretty sure we have about the most powerful incentive and accountability system in the world. And that's not necessarily all good, because it inhibits the actions of teachers and constrains the actions of teachers, and particularly head teachers, when they're thinking all the time, what's Ofsted going to think about this? So I think we need to be a lot more clever about our accountability system in this country. And here's a thought. What if the main thing that secondary schools were held to account on was the destinations of the young people who go there, what they end up in? And what if the secondary schools were held to account for 3 years after each young person left? That would make the schools think very carefully about the kind of experiences that the young people are getting educationally, but also in the kind of guidance they're being given to get them towards a fruitful, rich and rewarding occupation 3 years after they've left.
Right, well, that's an excellent point. Lucy, I'm going to give you the last word. We're running out of time and I'm not allowed to overrun, but I would like to...
So in 9 seconds, I want to cover early years and accountability systems. Very briefly, completely agree in early years investment, but it is important to remember that the early years curricula that we have, or certainly the curricula we have in year 1 and year 2, is more academic in focus than the Japanese curriculum at that age or the Korean curriculum at that age. What these top-performing systems are doing, they're starting school at 6 or 7. They have high-quality preschool, but what they're doing in that preschool is much, much broader, much less specific academic outcomes, which means that you do have time to give children that basis of understanding the social skills, the pre-academic reading and math skills, before expecting them to be meeting accountability targets. Because unfortunately, otherwise what happens is that teachers are forced to get children, or try and get children to that level, have to skip on to the next thing before they've really got to grips with the basics, and then they're just behind for the rest of their school education. Sorry, that's a negative thing to end on. But we can do it. Yes, we can do it. We can achieve
No, I mean,
social mobility.
we're all, I'm sure, familiar with the research about teaching kids to read too soon. I don't know what the rush is. Really don't. They're not going to be reading the news at age 2. I'd like to thank all our panelists. I'm really glad they didn't all agree. I think it makes for a much more interesting debate. I hope they've given you something to take away with you. And I'm sure you'll be able to look them all up on Google if you've got any questions for them. I'd like to give a special thanks to Debbie. I think it's quite a thing to stand up in front of such a big audience and speak so confidently. So thank you.
Shall we roll?
And thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you, as I said earlier, for staying. Bye-bye.